Contact! Break! Today we're going to be talking about the M21 rifle. Now, in many aspects, it looks a lot like an M14, but it differs in many very important ways. To me, the M21 is a very cool rifle because from the ground up, it was designed with the help of the Army marksmanship team to make a sniper rifle that could operate in the jungles of Vietnam. If you didn't know, the sniper role wasn't really prioritized within the United States military for a long time. The Marine Corps got it right for the most part, but it was the Army who lagged behind for a long time. Now, the M21 served from about the Vietnam War through 1988, where it was replaced by the M24. But until then, and even after then, and well into the GWAT, you saw the M21 press into service. Today, we're going to be talking about a very cool sniper rifle, basically something that was made out of necessity, the M21. But before we get into that, we of course have to thank the biggest sponsor of the channel. That is Primary Arms, doing so many cool things that we can't even begin to name them all. But whether you want a compact 1-day, whether you want a great pistol optic, we can't recommend them enough. And as always, harass their customer service team. Tell them how much you love Garand Thumb and, you know, just how much Primary Arms means to you. Go and check them out, guys. We love them. And of course, if you want to be a more American, what do we recommend, John?
Rifles.
That's right, Henry Repeating Arms. They make awesome lever actions, anything you could possibly want. And go check out henrythumb.com. Can't talk about it here, but there is a great surprise for you waiting there. And if you want to get better at shooting, we recommend dry fire. Mantis will turn your weapon into a dry fire machine. We highly recommend it. Finally, all ammunition is sponsored for by AAC. And we can't forget the Patreon. All the weirdest clips, John critiquing your deadlift form, all the outtakes, and of course, some ad-free stuff. Go check out the Patreon. So without further ado, let's talk about the M21. Just a wonderful piece of history. This particular one was built by Fulton Armory. Let's get into it. Now, the best part about Alice Kit is when you go prone, you can of course open it up so you can get down nice and flat. But today we're going to be grouping this rifle with a federal gold medal match. Now, to be clear, the ammunition used during the Vietnam War, when this was primarily used, was M118, which was considered a massive step up compared to the normal ball ammo that was typically issued with M14 rifles. Now, of course, with advancements in powder and slug technology, you have a far more accurate rifle than what you had during the Vietnam War. The Fulton Armory M21 that we have right here is about a 1.5, I believe, MOA rifle. We'll see how it actually does in our hands as we're shooting it. We do have a reproduction of the Redfield scope that was used on various rifles during that time. To be clear, most of the M21s that you saw in service were Leatherwood art scopes, which were awesome. They were a 3 to 9 power, and this is a 3 to 9 power as well, but the optic that we have on here was primarily used on the M40, which was used by the Marine Corps. The Army just had to be different and use the M21, of course. So without further ado, let's go ahead. Let's group this guy. Let's see how he does. Okay, we're going to be shooting. We're at 100 yards right now, and we're going to be grouping using federal gold medal match, and we'll go from there. Going for the top target. You full that one? Yeah. And then it ran out of ammo too. It was a different lot of ammo at that last one. My bad. Cool.
Honestly, not a bad group, dude. It walked a little bit, but like, I mean, I think a lot of that can be attributed to the target waving from the wind. Honestly, not bad.
All right, let's go check it out. This was my right in the range from when I was in the military. It was a TAC P. And my first note says, how to be better, stop f***ing up. So apparently that was some feedback I got. How wonderful. So we had one round with a wrong head stamp that was on me. You could see that changed to 0. But let's go ahead and take a look at what we got right here. This is our 5-shot group. So we're gonna go ahead. You know what? I think that is just about what's advertised, which is 1.5. Let's go ahead and confirm that though. Okay, we're at 1.5 MOA. That's pretty much what it looked like when I first was looking at it. So, you know, you might look at 1.5 MOA and be like, that's terrible. To be clear, the M14 on its own was like a 2 to 3 MOA gun. And we're also dealing with 60-year-old technology. There was a better version made of the M14 known as the M25. We'll do a video on that one later. But for the M21, 1.5 MOA is insanely accurate. For the M14, that is wonderful. And it is a very shootable, very nicely recoiling gun. And I also want to say that this was weighted in the wind. That makes it harder, right?
Yeah.
It makes me a phenomenal shot.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, you know what, let's not get retarded, actually. This is supposed to be serious.
All right, we are now at longish range. We're going to be employing a lot of the ranges that we're typically seeing at the M21. Now, being a 308 with a 22-inch barrel on this M21, it is capable of firing out to 8 to 900. But given the limitations of M118, which is a 7.62 by 5.1 round that was used during the Vietnam War, what was used, you know, about after that until better rounds were adopted, 600 was much more likely. In addition to that, both the Leatherwood Art scopes as well as these Redfield scopes, being 3 to 9, were ranged out to about 600 for what you could range a human being with, and that was about what was doable for the rifle at the time. Now today we're going to be shooting at 400 and 550, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're using Federal Gold Medal match, and it shouldn't be too difficult as long as I'm an okay shot. Okay, so shots are a little bit right. We got the impacts pretty well on that one. 400, really not that hard. In addition to that, you can see how quickly the round gets to those. To be clear, a lot of the shots taken during the Vietnam War were pretty short range. Now, going into the 80s, as sniper doctrine began to get a little bit more refined, some things were definitely changed up. John, do you want to talk a little bit about Sniper Spotter?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. The two-man sniper team, that was somewhat prevalent in the Vietnam War, and after that it became pretty big. But I think it's interesting that recently it's gone back to just one-man sniper teams, especially on the special operations side of the house. It's usually just a one-man show that kind of does his own thing on the raid. I think that's interesting.
It's gotta change up, right? Yeah. I guess it depends on the type of war that you're fighting. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll do a few more shots at 400, then we'll walk it out to 550. All right, let's go ahead and get it out to 550. What's cool is that ranging it with the reticle works absolutely perfectly. That was neat, you know? It's just very exciting. All right, going at 550. Nice. Okay. Once we got our dope on, what's great about having a spotter lets you know your adjustments. So not bad. There's definitely some limitations to the optic. We'll put up a little picture of what you're looking at, but there's no stadia, there's no drop, there's nothing. It's just crosshairs. Now it is doable. There's science and there's math that goes along with that. However, being a second focal plane optic, you really got to know what your holds are with this particular rifle, which speaks somewhat to the limitations of what they're able to do with it. By second focal plane, what we mean is that when you zoom in, the reticle itself does not change. This is in stark contrast to many optics nowadays that are used for a precision roll, which is when you zoom in on your target, you're essentially also zooming in on the reticle, which makes your holds and your zeros much, much easier. John, what do you think about that?
I think second focal plane is better for carbine optics, but
I get you.
First focal plane is definitely better for sniper systems, and as you can see, they had to work with what they had back in the day.
Hey, they made it work.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a story about a Vietnam sniper where, he waited like a week just crapping himself, letting himself get bit by snakes and bugs, waiting for an NBA commander to walk out.
Yeah, Carlos Hathcock, where he was crawling through the field.
That was it. Yeah, that was sick.
Yeah, men used to be men.
Yeah, now we don't know what gender we are. John, what gender are you?
I actually don't know anymore.
I decided I would be a furry.
A tiger fur?
Okay, guys, we've done a fair bit of shooting, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to the black screen. We're going to go over a lot of the history of it and have a good time. I think the history and the build quality of the M21 is a very interesting subject, so I hope you'll join me as we talk about that, and we'll go over a quick little bit about kit before we go there. To be clear, the M21 has served for a long time, and because of that, there's a lot of different kits that could have been worn. So me and John are about late 80s, early 90s with our kit, depending on how you look at it. So we have our typical just BDUs right here, minor raid modified by Hub City Outdoors. Raid modifications are simply slanting the pockets to make it easier to get in, and then adding the lower pocket, which is often not accessible due to the Alice gear, adding it onto the shoulders. You can see on John's BDU, this is the typical BDU that was issued. It wasn't always raid modified, it depended on the individual guy. BDU pants, very simple, big old cargo pocket, not much else to it. Just like old school, I'm bloused into the jungle boots. These are from Ultima. Now, I'm wearing Alice kit. Alice kit is, what's the best way to describe Alice kit, John? Simple but effective?
It was good. It was good, to be honest. It was actually pretty good, especially the rucks.
I love the Alice ruck. I still wear the Alice ruck to this day. Going through training, did you have to wear the Alice gear?
Not the gear, but the rucksack.
Always the rucksack. So for Alice gear, it's your basic web belt with a suspender. There's a lot of different types of suspenders out there. I have 2 magazine pouches. On my sides right here, these could be used for M14 or M16. Not exactly a quick change, but doable. From there going back, we have 2 canteen pouches because you always need water, and then you have a butt pack, whether that be for ponchos, extra grenades, smokes, whatever you may need. And then oftentimes a med kit could either be worn just up front with a field dressing, or worn in a cargo pocket, or in upper left of your blouse top. Both wearing boonies. It's a simple stitch to make it fold up front. And then wearing good old flight gloves, folded up. This is old school. And that is the basic kit for about late 80s, early 90s, and I think it looks fucking cool.
Yeah, this is us on Reforger.
You know, me and John, John more so than me, playing Reforger, and it just
being a nuisance,
and it's like a sad adult with a train set in his basement. You know?
Yeah, I guess.
All right, guys, let's get to the black screen. So we've done a lot of shooting, and now we're going to do a lot of talking. So something that you need to realize about the M21 was you had a rifle that was already in the U.S. inventory. You had an M14 that was then repurposed to be a Cold War era killing machine. Now, the thing you have to realize about that is a little bit of history. The U.S. had a really bad habit of putting together an excellent sniper system, sniper classes, a sniper MOS, or sniper rifles, and then completely dropping that after a war ended. From World War I through World War II, the Korean War, and onwards, we had the same cyclical thing happening where a good program was put into place and then was later disbanded. When the Vietnam War occurred, you essentially found the US Army scrambling to come up with some type of sniper program, but more importantly, a sniper rifle. One thing you need to realize is prior to the Vietnam War, the sniper rifle was an M1C, M1D, which was used in the Korean War. And this was fine for the Korean War being pressed back into service, but the problem reared its head in the Vietnam War when the M1 Garand was then reintroduced. However, the M1 Garand is chambered in .30-06. At this point, the M14 had been adopted, which is chambered in .308, and we had a huge logistical concern in terms of being able to supply the correct ammunition, not to mention the fact that, quite frankly, this rifle was already severely outdated. It was underperforming almost every way. You have to realize by about the 60s that the Soviets had come to the table with some very good sniper systems. In fact, the M21 was directly competing against the SVD, which in many ways was a very incredible rifle, built from the ground up to be a sniper system, a DMR, and I would say a better built sniper system, simply due to the fact that it was from the ground up built to be what it was. Now, there were a lot of concerns in terms of 7.62 by 5.4R, which is what the Dragunov is chambered in. This being a round that was designed in about 1891. Because of that, it had a lot of potential accuracy issues that just weren't addressed. Not to mention the lack of sniper-specific ammunition. You had a lot of troubles that kind of plagued the SVD until it was eventually solved. Now enter the M14/the M21. So in 1966, the Army realized that they needed to come out with a sniper system. The Marine Corps adopted the M40, which was a bolt-action system. Now, the great thing about using a bolt-action rifle, especially in terms of a sniper system, is that, well, if you don't want to shuck brass, then a bolt system really helps you control that, because imagine you're stalking some target, you're about to take your shot, you take your shot, that brass flinging out of the rifle can easily give away your position. Now, what the Army eventually kind of decided on was that they wanted something that could allow for repeat shots, which is why the M14 was ultimately selected. Now, what you have to realize is that there were national matches where the M14 was already significantly accurized by means of the United States Army Marksmanship Training Unit, or Marksmanship Team. So it was fairly well understood what needed to be done to the M14 in order to make it a more accurate rifle. Much like the Garand, there were a lot of issues that plagued it. Not specifically that it was inherently inaccurate, but rather there was a lot of rattling parts that would cause the rifle to settle in odd ways, and because of that, shot-to-shot placement could be affected by how those components all settled in. By 1967, they incorporated these lessons learned from the M14 National Match, which is what it was called, and incorporated that into the XM21, which would later become the M21 rifle. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of those modifications that were made to the M14 and what made the M21 such a deadly rifle. The other cool fact about the M21 that I also want to talk about is the fact that, yes, it did serve from about 1967 through about 1988 when it was replaced by the M24 sniper rifle. The M21 once again reared its ugly head during the global war on terror. As we found ourselves fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan and Iraq in complex urban environments, the need for a semi-automatic sniper rifle chambered in .308 that could rapidly take follow-up shots was recognized, and this rifle was quickly pressed back into service, albeit with much better optics. So let's get into it. Let's talk all about this. This particular rifle is built by Fulton Armory, which is kind of our go-to when it comes to Garands, M14s, and those types of systems, because they are experts on it. Now, it's not an exact clone. There's some differences in marking, or in the case of this build, differences in the optics. However, their particular rifle was made to be able to be used at different types of CMP vintage matches to make sure that it adhered to those rules. And it's close enough to where it works very well as an M21 substitute stand-in. It is very, very close. So when we're talking about the M21 sniper rifle, we're going to be mentioning National Match quite a bit. National Match isn't a company, it's anything like that. Rather, these are parts that are held to a higher specification to ensure that they can help increase the accuracy of the weapon. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the flash hider. The flash hider is a National Match flash hider. So what does that mean? Well, to understand that, we have to understand a little bit of the history of the M14. When the M14 was designed full auto. However, the M14 really suffered from being fairly uncontrollable in auto due to the dropped stock, the fact that the flash hider didn't work really well, just the action all led to a weapon that was somewhat uncontrollable. Not that it couldn't be, just in terms of a mass-issued rifle to soldiers, it was problematic. Now with the flash hider, they got it small enough around that diameter of that round to ensure that it could help really vent off those gases. It did not really do a good job of that. Now, when it came to the National Match flash hider, what they needed to change was to ensure that this wouldn't affect accuracy. The actual issued flash suppressors on the M14 were so undersized in some cases that you would have the slug actually touching the inside of the flash hider, which would of course negatively affect accuracy. So National Match flash hider is simply a flash hider that is opened up enough to work with the match ammunition of the time. Pretty psychotic if you ask me, so most modern M1As, M14s that are currently made do fall into that National Match spec, simply so that it doesn't affect accuracy as much. Now obviously we do have a mount for a bayonet, but going up to the front sight, we do have a National Match front sight, which is a thinner width compared to the normal type, so that if you were firing using the typical ghost ring sights that you have on the M1 or the M14, such as we have right here, that you could be more precise. Now in the case of the M21, it wasn't really necessary, as most of the time they were using the mounted optic. Coming to the barrel, there are several different things that happen with the barrel throughout the life of the M21. In general, the barrel that you see on the M21 was primarily a normal GI contour barrel that was simply held to National Match standards. That is, it was held to tighter tolerances. There were there was a lot more QC that went into the barrels to ensure that they were good shooters. Now you have to understand that after the Vietnam War ended and when kind of the sniper program picked back up in 1976, that most of those national match barrels had run out. So the military actually moved over to buying commercial variants. These include companies such as Douglas, Schillen, and Hart. I had to make sure I had my notes for that one. But those barrels took the place and performed much the same. Now, from there, the thing that we need to talk about is how they kept this rifle from shifting too much within the chassis, within all the parts, to ensure that it could be as accurate as possible. So let's talk about that. And the first thing we're going to talk about is unitization of the gas system. Now, this is something that is often misunderstood, and it comes down to a lot of history. It's kind of interesting doing videos on these older weapons, because what you have to realize is that, you know, when we talk about like an XM7 or an M7, how do you accurate an M7? There's still a lot of data coming out on that. But when it comes to the M1 Garand, the M14, the M1A, well, that has been figured out. These weapons have been used for a very long time, 50, 60, 70 years, and it is well understood how to make them more accurate. So let's go ahead and start talking about it. So the first thing we need to talk about is the front barrel band and the gas cylinder. So these two were not built with precision in mind, rather they were built with the idea that it should work. There was tolerance, and because of that, from shot to shot, these two could misalign, or not misalign, but rather settle in different variations between shots. This would negatively affect accuracy. So what the Army and the Marine Corps came up with was a process of keeping these two parts together so that there was less variation. When it came to the Army, they did a screw and glue or a screw and epoxy type build. The Marine Corps did some type of welding. Nowadays, there are parts that are made specifically to be unitized from the get-go so that it is more consistent. But this massively increased accuracy, and what you have to realize about it is it depended on the rifle. It wasn't specifically that if your rifle is shooting really good and you unitize the gas system, that immediately it shot a lot better, but rather that it was a step to ensure that if it was an issue, that it would not contribute negatively to accuracy. Another problem that they had is famously, the stocks on the M14 had a lot of issues with warping in the heat. So what was come up with when it came to the M21 was to use a stock that was impregnated with epoxy. So this was done by curing the rifle and then adding this to it to ensure that it would have the least amount of swung that would be occurring. In addition to this, there was also glass bedding added to the inside of the stock to ensure that the receiver wouldn't have as much flex and could lead to better accuracy. Now, later variations of the M21 and the M14, specifically the Crazy Horse or the M25, had different types of recoil lugs that were added to help solve this process. When it came to the M21, it didn't really have that. You did see certain variations towards the end of the 80s that did have it, but for the most part, it was glass bedding. With later models, you did see some McMillan stocks used or fiberglass stocks that could help solve that, but ultimately, it was a good solution. Now, the problem with the glass bedding was that it would break down over time, and as that glass bedding broke down, that would negatively affect accuracy, and this wasn't something that could be done in the field to get it back in working order. It would have to go to a trained up armorer who was an expert in his craft and could do it properly. Because of this, it wasn't exactly considered a great solution, but at the time, it was what was necessary to ensure that the M14 or the M21 was as accurate as necessary. Now, talking about those, you can really see how having a specifically built rifle for marksmanship was much better. This is why I'm a big fan of the SVD, because these were direct competitors. Now, the accuracy is fairly similar between them, but as far as maintenance was concerned, I consider the SVD to be a much easier platform overall to maintain. This isn't calling the M21 at all a bad system. No, indeed, the M21 put commies down no problem. However, we just need to accept history and understand that there were definite shortcomings to the M21 that were later solved in later variations. Now, moving over to the optic, this is probably one of the more interesting parts about it. The optic that we have here is a Leatherwood optic, is a 3 to 9 power, and it is wonderful. There were various types of optics that were used. This particular optic wouldn't have been used on an M21 from the Vietnam days, but later in service, about the mid-80s and on, you probably would have seen something like this. This optic was primarily seen on the M40 from the United States Marine Corps, but it did use the ART reticle.
Anodized green, is that like standard how they work?
Black or anodized green?
Yeah, I was curious about that.
No, it's a good question. Now, what ART stands for is Automatic Ranging Telescope. Now, the ART system was quite good. It allowed you to, through the reticle, range different targets by measuring them with some specific hash marks into the optic. Now, this is very similar to the PSO1, which this isn't the exact optic. However, it has the same reticle. The PSO reticle allowed you to quickly range targets. I would say better than what you saw on the ART. That being said, the ART was a really good system and many kills were made with it because it was utilized well and the snipers were trained well. The kind of biggest concern when it came to the M21 was making sure that the optic didn't shift too much, that it could stay nice and tight up against the receiver. This has always been an issue with the M14, but these early mounts did a really good job of squeezing all the accuracy that they could out of the M14. Indeed, the M21, without major changes to the receiver geometry, major changes to the barrel and stuff, was probably about as much as you could squeeze out of the M14 without a small redesign like what we saw with the XM25 later to become the M25. Now, in the case of Fulton Armory, much like the Army, Fulton Armory has a national match type M14 called the Enhanced Service Rifle. This is built off their Enhanced Service Rifle, just like M21s would have been built off of M14 national match rifles. So this is much so in the same vein of what the Army did. Now, small differences. This is a prototype from Fulton Armory, so understand that the actual build that you'll see from Fulton Armory will be slightly different, including receiver markings. But typically, there was some type of marking to designate it as an M21, whether that be on the heel, behind the front sight, whether they marked out the M14 or not, you would see some type of marking. Now, this particular one is still marked M14, 7.62 millimeter M14 rifle, but it should be noted that there would be some variation in the receiver markings on the M21s. So moving back, we do have our typical 1907 slings. These, of course, could be adjusted, could be wrapped around the arm. In combat, you didn't really see that too much. Moving back, we do have your typical magazines that you'd have from the M14, 20 rounds. There were different types that were used, but mostly you saw a 20-round magazine. Now, same thing when it came to our op rod, to our bolts. These were all national match. They were held to a much higher standard. And again, the M21 was capable of about 1.5 MOA, which is considered pretty incredible for the time, and even now is still considered very, very good. Moving back from here, you do notice that we do have kind of our own built cheek riser. In the field, soldiers would have done multiple things, being that this is kind of a mid-80s to late 80s build. This is very much so on the money. 100-mile-per-hour tape wrapped around some foam to make sure that I can get an easier cheek purchase when looking through that optic. Overall, this kind of brings us to the end of the M21. The M21 was a very interesting rifle. It was made to squeeze everything out of the M14, and it did a very good job of that. There were many downfalls or many cons to the M21, but ultimately it served the military for a long time and indeed continued to serve well through the global war on terror until it was replaced by the M110. You know, the M14 really didn't serve for that long, and yet you saw it continually pressed back into service over time. Not because it was the best, it's because, well, it's what we had. But that's kind of the American spirit of a rifle kind of coming back and still being made to work due to the excellent training in the United States military and their soldiers who were utilizing it. When it comes to this particular build is an absolute dream to shoot. Both accurate, extremely soft in the shoulder to fire, and you know what? I always have just loved the look of the M14, whether it be from Black Hawk Down, from movies as a kid. I have just always loved the look of it. I love the look of the Garand, and the M14 is much so in the same lines. In many cases, people have said that the M14 is the M1 Garand on a diet because it looks a little slimmer. So old girl lost some weight. She looks great. Highly recommended. If you guys get a chance to get your hands on an M21, or specifically the Fulton Armory build, I don't think you'll be sad. It is pricey. They come in at around 3,000 plus. Unfortunately, when it comes to an M14, there's just no cheap way about it. The Springfield M1As, they're okay, but they don't hold nearly the accuracy of better builds such as Smith Enterprises, Fulton Armory, or LRB. So your money definitely goes a long way when it comes to these builds, and you won't be sad about them, and they are a wonderful piece of history. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We got tons of things coming, and as always, stay looking cool. And final note for you guys is get yourself some woodland camis, because you know what? It is still the best camo out there. Don't forget the Patreon, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you later.